Chapter 19.
At the 30-mile level, the tunnel abruptly ended. Glancing at his temperature gauge, Gaia saw that it now registered slightly over 2,200 degrees. He stared around, everything darkly colored by the filters across his transparent faceplate. The red-hot rocks were jelly-like to his touch, but large areas of denser substance still maintained a deep green hue and stood out in marked contrast against the glowing, tumbled landscape upon which they had emerged. Now weightless, he barely floated above the floor of the tunnel's mouth. Gaia motioned for his companions to move closer. He listened to the crackle in his helmet. It was hard to make out what Maka was saying. "Oh, Onyx?" Maka's voice sounded faint through the radioactive static. He was asking if they should move off to search for the precious hot dust. "Wait," Gaia commanded. "We'll head along the shoreline. We've several miles to go. This part of the shore was worked out ages ago." Maka nodded and looked about him with excited curiosity. It was his first trip this far down. When they passed between two dark ridges that bordered the tunnel's end, he gasped and fell back a step. Directly beyond was a terrifying spectacle: the azure face of Unu. As far as his straining eyes could see, a vast ocean of molten rock heaved and tossed in the yellow-white mists that reached above it. Maka watched a great swell reach up and splash against the olive-hued ceiling of the endless cavern. Fingers of flame raced along the rocks, then dropped back into the boiling cauldron. From the beginning of time, this ceaseless motion had continued. This was Unu, the source of energy and life, a strange sea of red-hot rock and magma thousands of miles deep. Maka could not know that even deeper was another fiery world, where the layer of melted rock became the Earth's inner core of liquid iron, where temperatures were almost 6,000 degrees. Only a few citizens of Hod had ever gazed on the inner core, but the people of Maka's city had gone down to this sea of molten rock many times to obtain the hot dust which ran their machines. "How will we know where to dig for it?" Maka asked. "We do not dig," Gaia replied, "we scoop it from crevices in the green rock. There is a cave some distance along the shore. We have been working it for the past several hundred kejuls. Follow me." And he moved off in the peculiar shuffling step the neutrogravity control made necessary. It was a strange shoreline to follow. Maka cringed back each time his legs sank into the molten rock, fully expecting to be seared to the bone. But the fiery magma only hissed and gurgled against his protective suit. He moved along, close behind Gaia. It was a few moments later that he heard a brief scream, and, wheeling about, he saw two of the huntsmen suddenly enveloped by a large wave. For an instant they were outlined against the blazing liquid, then they lost their balance and fell off the narrow ledge into the sea. The half-formed cry for help was silenced as if by a giant hand across one hapless victim's mouth. He had a last glimpse of a waving arm, the webbed fingers clenched in agony, then the orange wave slapped down, and globs of thick magma were tossed high. Maka fought back his own scream and stared dumbly at the empty surface of Unu. It was over. He felt Gaia's arm about his middle, steadying him. Turning, he looked with horror at the veteran huntsman. "It happens," Gaia said. His voice was wooden. "Unu claims the careless ones. Did they die quickly?" Maka asked, fighting to keep his voice calm. "They are not dead. Not yet. Their fire suits will protect them for a long time. Perhaps they will only die when they starve or are consumed by thirst." As the import of his words made itself felt on the young huntsman's mind, he swayed dizzily. It was only Gaia's firm grasp which kept him from joining the two doomed men. "You mean they are sinking down into Unu?" he finally whispered. "Yes. Not even the fire suit's neutro force can overcome the pull of the sea. They will sink deeper and deeper. If Unu has a bottom, they will reach it. Come on. We have work to do." Some minutes later, the new forward scout called back a warning. "Gaia. Take shelter. A firestorm is coming." The huntsman scurried about wildly, seeking holes in which to hide from the approaching danger. Gaia and Kriai both plunged into the same small cave and tried to squeeze their way deeper behind the jagged wall. Automatically, they each reached up and turned their filter screens to maximum density. Gaia dared to glance out along the shoreline. He watched a swirling cloud form far down the shore and leap toward their pitiful refuge. The wind was deafening as the superheated gases roared closer. Around and around the pink and yellow clouds spun, until they were blurs of motion. And wherever they touched the rocky shore, the rocks flew apart like shrapnel hitting a concrete wall. "Unu, save us," he gasped, closing his eyes. The fire cloud shrieked along the cliff and was upon them. He felt his taloned fingers being plucked from the cave wall and he was tossed into the air. This was the end, he knew. Tumbling crazily, he smashed against the solid wall and sprawled on his back. A soundless scream rose in his throat. Then everything turned to silence. For a long time, Gaia lay inert, scarcely daring to breathe. He opened his eyes. Staring about, he realized that he had been tossed deeper into the cave. Unu had spared him this time. Kriai stirred by his side and sat up with a groan. It was the first sound Gaia had heard since the fire cloud had passed them. "Let's see who is left," Kriai said, testing himself to see if any limbs were broken. "I am still in one piece," he finally muttered. They crawled out of the cave. Gaia's repeated shouts echoed vainly in their helmets. He called again and again. "No use," Kriai told him. "They've either been torn to shreds or blown far out to sea." Gaia finally gave up the useless search. He sank down on the floor of the cave with a shuddering sigh. Gone. All gone. Too quick, Kriai, too quick. "What do we do now?" Kriai demanded, his pockmarked face twitching visibly as he removed the heavy filter screen. "We go on, of course. But, Gaia, there are just the two of us. We can't bring back enough hot dust by ourselves." Gaia thought it over and shook his head. "Maybe not, but we were assigned to the hunt and I've never come back without a full pack." He got to his feet. "You can turn back if you wish, Kriai." Kriai shrugged. "I'll go with you." They strode off down the shore. The going was increasingly difficult, for the firestorm had tumbled great rocks of olivine along the narrow beach. It was now a matter of climbing up or circling the giant boulders. Kriai finally sat down behind a large rock. Gaia joined him. "We'll rest for a time," Kriai said. "Do you want to sleep while I keep guard?" "I guess I'd better. I haven't slept for nearly 2 kedules." "All right. Get some sleep. I'll wake you in a while." Gaia sprawled on the steaming ground, crossed his arms over his chest and closed his eyes. Kriai leaned back against the rock, his ice gun cradled in his lap. The danger of being confronted by a Kapix was past now, but there were other creatures, great birds with suction cup claws for clinging to the cliffs, for example. These were called cockles and their prey was any moving thing. There were also huge slugs called madrids, capable of boring through solid rock. And the most terrible of all, the stoa. Kriai recalled old Balu's vivid description of these fearful monsters, and his grip about the ice gun tightened. Only the huntsman had ever dared invade this lower world, and then only in the narrowest area along the shore. Kriai turned his helmet's audio unit to full intensity and listened apprehensively. The dull crackling monotone filled his ears and he found himself straining for an unfamiliar sound. Then it was Kriai's turn to sleep. Later, after a brief meal of food concentrates, the two started along the shore toward the cave where the onyx dust could be found. Kriai was melancholy, and Gaia's few efforts to start a conversation met with failure. As they shuffled across the steaming rocks, Kriai's eyes were vacant and unfocused. More than once he stumbled, and Gaia finally seized him roughly by the shoulders. "Now listen, Kriai. I know how you feel, seeing our whole party wiped out in a few minutes. But if you don't want the same fate, you'd better keep alert. We've another 2 hours travel to reach the cave." Kriai nodded and made an effort to concentrate on the dangerous mission. It was well that he did. He suddenly grabbed his companion by one arm and jerked him backward. Gaia sprawled on the ground, then frantically rolled to one side as the rocks suddenly parted directly before them. He stared down into a dark gulf, then scrambled to his feet. The two huntsmen cowered against the side of the cliff as a pillar of flame shot up from the depths. The ripped shoreline heaved and buckled, throwing them off their feet. Then the yawning gulf slammed shut with a grating crunch. A final blast of steam sizzled against their fire suits and the quake subsided. What was that? Kriai finally muttered, his tongue thick against the roof of his mouth. A death fall, Gaia replied, fighting to control his shaking body. I've seen them a few times before, but never this close. What next? Kriai whispered. I've been on 8 hunts, but none was ever like this one. Gaia's reply was drowned out in a blinding flash of light that caught them completely unprepared. They threw up their arms in a frantic effort to protect their eyes from the intense glare. Watch out! The warning cry was torn from Gaia's lips as the yellow sky exploded into a myriad of colors and a bolt of lightning arced out of the boiling sea. The shockwave reached toward them, actually visible as a blur of movement. They had time for the barest gasp before both huntsmen were swept from their feet and tossed against the cliff. Another thunderous roar followed, and again the skies became a nightmare rainbow. Kriai cowered in a heap, squeezing his hands about his ears. His companion stirred weakly. Shelter, find shelter, Gaia groaned. Run, Kriai, or you're doomed. He tried to crawl, but had to lie back, fighting the pain in his leg. Staring down, he saw a tiny tear in his fire suit. The terrible heat was searing him in that spot, and he could feel his flesh beginning to bubble. Kriai started to flee, but when he saw his companion's plight, he rushed to his side. Go, Kriai, in Unu's name, go before it's too late, Gaia shouted. Blast yourself a hole and hide from the storm. Kriai cast a single glance at the menacing skies and pointed his ice gun at the ground. The pale beam struck the rock and it turned white. Kriai then stamped down and sank waist-deep into the suddenly pulverized material. He continued to blast until he had made a deep trench. Then he lay down and 210. Blasted a horizontal tunnel several feet below the surface. Seizing the writhing form of Gaia, he dragged him down to the shelter. Momentarily safe, he now turned his attention to the ugly tear in the groaning huntsman's suit. He opened his emergency pack and took out a length of diamondite cloth which he pressed hard across the rip. The material fused itself to the suit. Gaia screamed in anguish, but Kriai lay across his struggling body and forced a pellet of Janu into the wounded victim's mouth. Gaia shuddered, then lapsed into unconsciousness. Outside, the cyclone wind raged and howled over the mouth of their improvised cave. Kriai grimly waited for the storm to subside. He knew it had been spawned by the recent fireball and would last only until the temperature imbalance leveled off. He decided to dig deeper with his ice gun and soon both huntsmen were several yards underground. Despite his fright, Kriai remembered to tunnel at an angle, so they could climb back out. Exhausted by his efforts, he finally lay face down and waited. An hour passed. The fury outside subsided to an occasional grumble of thunder, and he knew the firestorm was over. They had again survived. Gaia stirred and opened his eyes. They were still glassy, but the effect of the drug was wearing off. He sat up and felt his leg. It's dead. I'll not walk again. Nonsense, Kriai told him. It's just numb. You'll be all right. We closed the tear in time. Gaia got to his feet, forced to hunch over in the shallow tunnel. He gently tested his leg by taking a step. Although it still felt as if it were not there, he could walk. Come on, he said, let's climb out of this hole and hunt for onyx dust. 2 more miles? Kriai asked as they shuffled along. Just about, Gaia answered. The great cave lies somewhere beyond a steep hill. It's in the side of a tall mountain that reaches up out of sight. That's right. I'd forgotten, said Kriai. They had come to a place where the shoreline rose abruptly in a mound like a hill that barred their way. Before they reached it, Kriai had glimpsed an even more precipitous rise behind it, a high cliff of black rock marked by outcrops of green and white quartz. The cliff has been pushed up by some kind of subterranean explosion, I suppose, said Gaia. And the cave? What of it? Maybe it has been destroyed as well. Maybe. But the big mountain has stood there for thousands of kedules. Let's hope not. They blasted handholds in the cliff's face with their ice guns, but progress up the wall was painfully slow. When they finally reached the top, they paused a moment to look back at the boiling sea and the rubble-strewn shore below. "It will be a long trip back," Kriai said. "We haven't reached our goal yet, friend. This may be the most dangerous part of all." Gaia studied the looming mountain ahead. "Look." Kriai pointed toward the mountain, at two strange forms gliding in the air. They were birds with long, reptilian bodies and gigantic wings. "Guttles," Gaia murmured. "They make their home in high places. They'll eat anything that moves, although they prefer madrids, the big slugs that burrow into the sides of cliffs. But with those thin necks, how can they swallow anything?" Kriai asked. "Don't be fooled," Gaia cautioned him. "Their necks swell up enormously when they swallow. If they attack, use your ice gun. A direct hit will make them explode." Kriai snapped his weapon into the clamp at his belt, then pulled it free quickly to test it. Satisfied, he inched his way down the other side of the cliff. Descending was easier, as the slope on this side was more gradual. The Guttles were wheeling in circles, about a quarter of a mile away, but when they detected movement, they circled closer. Suddenly they plummeted like arrows toward the huntsman. Gaia leaned back against the rocks and sighted down his gun. Then he squeezed the trigger. The flying reptile disappeared in a spray of frozen bits. Kriai shot the other flying monster. It fell to the ground below them, one wing was still thrashing. Gaia got close to the beast and blasted it to extinction. The mountain lay directly ahead, but there was a half-hour walk along the level ground before they stood at its base. Gaia studied its rugged sides anxiously, seeking a familiar landmark to point the way to the cave. There. Over there. Kriai had discovered the dark opening, its mouth partly blocked by rubble. Scrambling over chunks of quartz, olivine, and diamond, the huntsmen entered the cave. But even as they entered the cave, the earth shook slightly. A constant rain of dust and grit fell from the roof. Gaia led his companion deep into the gloom, back where the onyx dust could be gathered. Their movements were silent, almost ghost-like as they slid their feet forward across the cavern floor. "Here we are." Gaia waved a hand toward the rock wall and Kriai eagerly unslung his dust box and placed it on the floor. He pressed several neutrotabs onto the carrier and activated them, and it floated just above the ground. Gaia did the same. When the boxes were filled, it would be a heavy burden, for no amount of neutralizing could adequately cancel out the compressed weight of the radioactive dust. They unsnapped a small pick and a pair of tongs from their belts and crouched beside a rock outcrop. The dust shone dully, tiny specks of black against the dark green slabs. The two huntsmen patiently chipped and lifted out the stuff, a few grains at a time. Each precious bit was placed inside the waiting boxes. Gaia adjusted his filter screen to maximum intensity to protect his eyes from the unseen gamma rays. Suddenly, without warning, a huge piece of rock crashed down behind them. The noise echoed through the cavern. "We must work more carefully," Gaia said. "We're setting up vibrations through the rock strata." Kriai nodded. It took an hour to complete the task. Then each of the huntsmen carefully sealed his dust box and slowly lifted it to his back. "Ooh, that's heavy," Kriai exclaimed. "They'll have to send back another party right away," Gaia said as they worked toward the mouth of the cave. "We've got less than a third of the normal load. It'll be a long time before I come back down here," Kriai told him. "Fighting is one thing, but collecting hot dust has never appealed to me." "It's our sacred duty to come," Gaia would say in reply. But he thought Tur was all himself. Why isn't there a machine, or a conveyor belt to do the job? Then he reminded himself that the machines of Garn were falling apart and being abandoned, year by year. He thought of the mole lying abandoned and useless in the city square, because nobody knew how to repair its hidden mechanism. That strange vehicle could have transported onyx dust back to the city easily and in a matter of a few hours. But though the history discs described its capabilities, no living Gainian had ever seen it in operation. Someday, he thought, the whole city would grind to a final halt. Heresy. Treason. He put the wicked thought out of his mind and walked quickly from the cave. They were trudging back across the valley toward the distant hill when Kriai stopped and pointed. "Look," he said to Gaia. The floor of the valley had erupted about 100 yards away, and a geyser of white-hot vapor shot upward. Protruding from the settling steam was a blunt-nosed cylinder, its sides glowing white-hot. "What is it?" Kriai shouted, swinging his ice gun to a ready position.